And there was a Reverend Philip Brooks, a pastor, and he preached to his congregation. And so many of his church family wore black because their husbands, their sons, were killed in that war, fighting to preserve the Union, fighting to stop slavery. And his heart, he was just really, really down. And his church family gave Reverend Philip Brooks a sabbatical. They said, go to the Holy Land, you need to be renewed. It was so sad seeing so many people wearing black clothes, a sign of mourning. So he went to Jerusalem, and on Christmas Eve, remember this is before electricity was used with lights, he went by horseback from Jerusalem. He went to Bethlehem, and it was very dark. There were no lights in the city itself of Bethlehem. It was very poor at that time. And overhead he could see the wonderful, wonderful starry night. And he wrote a wonderful hymn, O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. And it goes on to say, and here's the key, in thy dark streets shineth. Now, he had been through some dark streets there in his church family and through the war. There are dark streets of life. Today we had a joyous moment, and we should celebrate the mountaintop experiences. And others of our church family, as these flowers were given by Grandma in honor of Dusty, in memory of Dusty, we also go through the valley of the shadow of death with the deepest of sadness or hard times. And so we have the glorious moments and the hard times of life. We have the green pastures and still waters, and we walk through that valley of the shadow of death. And he wrote that wonderful line, in thy dark streets shineth the everlasting light, and that's the message of Christmas. Emmanuel, as our choir sang last week, it means God is with us. We don't walk alone through life. Our good shepherd is with us. And he said in John chapter 10, nobody can take you out of my hand. And in John 14, in the upper room, he said, I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, so that where I am, there you may be also. And the newer translation says, I will come and get you. That's a wonderful confidence that no one can take us from Jesus' hand. Now, there were great tragedies, and I want to tell another story that comes out of the Civil War. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the great, great poet, his wife, they had like these huge cotton gowns, sort of like Mayfete gowns. And she was lighting a candle in 1861, and some of the hot wax got on her dress. It blew into flames, and she burned to death. That was just so, so tragic. And then, in 1863, his oldest boy, Charles Appleton Longfellow, joined the Union cause as a soldier, and he didn't tell Dad. And Longfellow got this letter dated March the 14th, 1863. I tried to resist the temptation of going without your leave, but I cannot any longer. I feel it my first duty to do what I can for my country, and I would willingly lay down my life for it if it would do any good. He got an appointment as a lieutenant, but in November he was severely wounded in the Battle of New Hope Church in Virginia during the Mine Run campaign. So, his wife dies, his boy has been seriously wounded in November, and on Christmas Day, he writes us a Christmas carol. And it goes like this, you know it. I heard the bells on Christmas Day, their old familiar carols play, and wild and sweet the words repeat, of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And thought how, as the day had come, the belfries of all Christendom had rolled along that unbroken song of peace on earth, goodwill to men, till ringing, singing on its way, the world revolved from night to day, a voice, a chime, a chant sublime, of peace on earth, goodwill to men. But he's sad, his kid's very sick, and as retired Colonel Mace Carpenter, who did the tours over at Gettysburg, will tell you the cannonade that Robert E. Lee had upon the Union soldiers was the greatest cannon bombardment ever in history. It was huge. Fortunately, it overshot the main line. And it was just so horrible that they could hear it in Harrisburg, miles and miles away, that terrible pounding. So he writes this, and from each accursed mouth the cannon thundered in the south, and with the sound the carols drowned of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Now, for our kids, a hearthstone is the stones in front of a fireplace where people could be warm and it wouldn't catch on fire. It was as if an earthquake rent the hearthstones of a continent and made forlorn the households born of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And in despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. But his boy was getting better, the wounded son. Then the bells ringed more loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men. So in the face of darkness, in the face of suffering, of so much death, he said, the wrong will fail, the right prevail, that peace would come. And those were words of faith before the war was over. Well, Jesus in John chapter 8 says, I'm the light of the world. And Jesus wants to bring us light and hope to add to the joy of the good moments as we had today, but also to give us light, to know that whatever trials we go through, we don't go through those trials alone, that love is with us. And my very favorite Christmas story, it comes from, and is found in the Guidepost Christmas Treasury. I just love this story because it has such a message for us. And I want to say this. When I had a chance to go to the Grotto of the Nativity on my pilgrimage in the Holy Land, you come into that great Bethlehem church, and the door, you have to kind of get down low to come in, kind of humble, and it was because the Arab conquerors would ride their horses into church. And they decided, if we make the doorway really low, the horses can't come in. And you come on in, and they take you downstairs. And they have a place where they think that Jesus was born. They have lamps hanging there. But there's also a dark side, because as you continue in the tunnels, they take you into a children's cemetery where they had spots. And the guide said, this could have been where Herod had the babies, where the babies were killed by Herod would have been placed. And so there was a dark side to Christmas, as Jesus had to flee Bethlehem and go as a refugee down to Egypt until Herod had died. There are these dark moments. But here's the key. God's love always remains. God's love is always here. And it's a story by Ruma West. And it's remarkable because it talks about the dark times. It should have been, she said, the worst, the bleakest of Christmases. It turned out to be the loveliest Christmas in her life. Did you hear what she said? It should have been the worst, and we'll see why it should have been worst. I was 9 years old, one of 7 children. We lived in a little farming town out west. It had been a tragic year for all of us, but we still had our father, and that made all the difference. Every year in our town, a Christmas Eve social was held at the church. How well I remember Dad buttoning our coats, placing us on our long homemade sled and sleigh, and pulled us to church about a mile away. Can you picture Dad pulling that long sleigh? We'll see why. It was snowing. How cold and good it felt on our faces. We held tight to one another, and above the crunch of snow beneath Dad's feet, we could hear him softly whistling, "Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright." Mama had died the previous summer. Now, this is one reason it should have been the worst. She had been confined to her bed for 3 years. Dad had assumed all mother and father responsibilities. I remember him standing me on a stool by our big round kitchen table and teaching me how to mix bread. But my main task was being Mama's hands and feet until that day in June, her own birthday, when she died. 2 months later came the big fire. Now this will explain why he had to drag the sleigh to church. Our barn, our shed, our haystacks, our livestock were all destroyed. It was a calamity. That's all the financial resources. That's the security. But Dad stood between us and the disaster. We weren't even aware how poor we were, but we had no money at all. I don't remember much about the Christmas Eve social. I just remember Dad pulling us there and pulling us back. Later, in the front room around our pot-bellied stove, he served us warm milk and bread. Our Christmas tree, topped with a little worn cardboard angel, had been brought from the nearby hills. Strings of homemade popcorn made it the most beautiful tree I had ever seen or smelled. After supper, Dad made all 7 of us sit in a half circle by the tree. I remember I wore a long flannel nightgown. He sat on the floor facing us and told us he was ready to give us our Christmas gift. We waited puzzled because we thought Christmas presents were for Christmas morning. Dad looked at our expectant faces. "Long ago," he said, "on a night like this, some poor shepherds were watching their sheep on a lonely hillside. When all of a sudden," now his quiet voice went on and on, telling the story of the Christ child in his own simple words. And I'll never forget how love and gratitude seemed to fill the room. There was light from the oil lamp and the warmth from the stove, but somehow it was more than that. We felt Mama's presence, and we learned that loving someone was far more important than having something. I'll repeat that. We learned that loving someone was far more important than having something. We were filled with peace, happiness, and joy. And when the story was ended, Dad had us all kneel for a family prayer. And he said, now here's the key why I'm sharing this story. Try to remember when everything else seems to be lost. It was Mama, it was the barn, it was the animals, it was the crops. So try to remember when everything else seems to be lost, the greatest thing of all remains God's love for us. It's God's love for you. God's love for me. That's what Christmas means, he said. It's the gift that could never be taken away. The next morning, we found that Dad had whittled from wood little presents for each of us and hung them on the tree. Wooden dolls for the girls, wooden whistles for the boys. But he was right. He had given us our real gift the night before. But I like what Dad said. Try to remember when everything seems lost. And perhaps each of us will walk through the valley of the dark shadows, the shadow of the valley of death. We'll have the mountaintop experiences, but we'll have the tough times too. Try to remember the greatest thing of all remains God's love for us. And in thy dark street shineth the everlasting light. The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. Amen.